In 1959, a single phone call changed everything for Susan Oliver. It was a call she'd been waiting for, confirmation of a role that could make her a household name. She didn't scream or celebrate when the news came through. Instead, she calmly set the receiver down, took a deep breath, and walked to the window of her modest apartment. She lit a cigarette, her fingers trembling slightly, and stared out at the sprawling chaos of Los Angeles below her. To anyone watching, she might have looked like another young actress on the brink of a breakthrough. But if they looked closer, they'd have seen it. The slight tilt of her head, the faint smirk playing at the corner of her lips. It wasn't relief she was feeling. It was defiance. Susan Oliver wasn't just another actress hoping to land a role. She was a woman with ambitions too big for the world she'd been born into. The role she'd just secured wasn't an end. It was a means to escape. Not from Hollywood exactly, but from everything it represented. Within a decade, Susan would walk away from the bright lights and adoring crowds altogether. And when she did, she would leave behind a trail of unanswered questions. Why did someone with so much talent, someone poised to become a star, seem so determined to disappear? There were whispers, a fallout with powerful producers, a scandal that threatened to derail her career, a growing obsession with the skies, one that saw her risk everything to defy gravity itself. Susan Oliver lived her life like a storm, beautiful, unpredictable, and impossible to pin down. But storms, as we know, leave wreckage in their wake, and hers was no exception. What drove Susan Oliver to step away from everything she'd worked for, and why, decades after her death, does her name still stir fascination and mystery among those who remember her? The answers lie in a story as thrilling and tragic as the woman herself, a story of rebellion, ambition, and a relentless quest for freedom that ultimately came at an unimaginable cost. Born for stardom, bound for more. Susan Oliver was born Charlotte Gurka on February 13, 1932 in New York City, a place that seemed to hum with the promise of possibility. But her childhood was far from idyllic. Her parents divorced when she was young, and Susan split her formative years between her mother, Ruth, a talented journalist, and her father, George, who worked as a political reporter. She grew up surrounded by the sharp wit and unrelenting drive of a family steeped in ambition. But ambition alone couldn't shield her from tragedy. When Susan was still a teenager, her father died in a plane crash, an event that would haunt her and influence her fascination with aviation later in life. It wasn't just the loss that stayed with her, it was the suddenness of it, the reminder that life could tilt into chaos at any moment. In the wake of her father's death, Susan turned her sights toward acting. By her early 20s, she had transformed herself into a striking young woman with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence. She knew she wasn't just pretty, she was magnetic, and in the unforgiving world of post-war Hollywood, that made all the difference. Susan rechristened herself with a name as sharp and elegant as her features, Susan Oliver. The name fit perfectly on a marquee, and in the early 1950s, she began working tirelessly to earn her place there. She started small landing bit parts in live television dramas and working her way into New York's bustling theater scene. Critics noted her talent early on. She was more than a pretty face, and casting directors began to take notice. But her big break came in 1957 when she was cast in The Green-Eyed Blonde. It was a small film, and Susan wasn't the lead, but she didn't need to be. Her performance was electric, and it was enough to land her roles in the growing world of television. By 1958, she was on a roll. Television dramas, including The Untouchables and Route 66, became her domain, and she shined in roles that required both vulnerability and strength. Susan had a way of making audiences lean in, of holding their gaze without ever seeming to try. She wasn't just acting, she was commanding attention. What Susan didn't reveal, even as her star began to rise, was her growing dissatisfaction. She had always wanted more than just success. She wanted control. Hollywood had little patience for women with ideas about their careers, but Susan was unwilling to accept the roles handed to her without question. She began pushing back, seeking opportunities that would challenge her instead of confining her to the predictable mold of blonde ingenue. But Hollywood didn't make room for women like her. Producers dismissed her ideas, directors questioned her motives, and agents urged her to play along if she wanted to make it big. Susan smiled politely at their advice but ignored it. She had her own plan. She didn't just want to be an actress. She wanted to escape the confines of the industry altogether. But for that, she needed something more than talent. She needed a way out, and she would find it. But not in Hollywood, not on television screens or movie sets. Susan Oliver's escape would come from somewhere far more daring, a place that most of Hollywood's leading ladies wouldn't have dared to venture. It was only a matter of time before the turbulence of her ambition collided with the tightly controlled machine of the entertainment industry, and when it did, the cracks would begin to show. By the time Hollywood finally realized what it had in Susan Oliver, it was already too late. The Queen of the Small Screen. By the late 1950s, Susan Oliver was becoming a familiar face on television screens across America. It was the golden era of anthology dramas and episodic storytelling, and Susan's talent for sinking into diverse roles made her a prized guest star. The industry buzzed with whispers about her, a versatile actress with striking looks and a captivating screen presence. But her breakthrough came in 1959 with The Twilight Zone. Cast in the episode People Are Alike All Over, Susan played the role of a Martian who lures a stranded astronaut into a gilded trap. Her performance was mesmerizing, and the episode became one of the show's most iconic entries. It wasn't just the writing that made it memorable. It was Susan's ability to balance warmth and menace, making her alien character both seductive and terrifying. This wasn't just acting, it was mastery. Susan had a rare gift, the ability to convey complex emotions with the subtlest expressions. Casting directors raved about her, and it seemed like she was destined to become one of Hollywood's next leading ladies. But it wasn't the silver screen that would immortalize her face. It was television. Over the next few years, Susan appeared in hit shows like Wagon Train, Gunsmoke, and The Andy Griffith Show. She was a chameleon, slipping effortlessly from a pioneer woman to a femme fatale to a comedic foil. The pinnacle of her television career came in 1965 when she landed a role in Star Trek's first pilot, The Cage. Cast as Vina, a human survivor stranded on a distant planet, Susan delivered a haunting performance. In one unforgettable sequence, her character appeared as a green-skinned alien seductress, an image that became synonymous with the Star Trek franchise itself. But behind the scenes, the role was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it cemented her status as an iconic figure in science fiction, a genre that was beginning to gain traction as a serious storytelling medium. On the other hand, it was a stark reminder of the industry's limitations. Even in a groundbreaking show like Star Trek, Susan's role was defined more by her appearance than her talent. Hollywood's dream girl, Hollywood's nightmare. As Susan Oliver's star continued to rise, so did her reputation for pushing back against the rigid expectations of Hollywood. For a time, she was seen as the industry's dream girl, talented, striking, and capable of elevating even the most forgettable scripts. Producers praised her professionalism, and audiences adored her. But behind the scenes, Susan was fighting a battle that would ultimately define her career. A battle against a system that didn't welcome strong-willed women. By the early 1960s, Susan's struggles with typecasting were becoming evident. Hollywood had a formula for women like her: play the love interest, the damsel in distress, or the occasional femme fatale. Susan, however, wanted more. She yearned for roles that explored the complexity of human experience, roles that challenged her as an artist. This friction came to a head in her dealings with powerful producers and casting directors. Susan's refusal to conform to the mold was seen by some as defiance. She would later recount instances where turning down roles she deemed shallow led to career opportunities drying up. Her independent streak, admired by her peers, was perceived as troublesome by those who controlled the levers of power in Hollywood. Adding to her frustrations was the relentless scrutiny women faced in the industry. Susan was a private person, but Hollywood demanded its actresses to live their lives in the public eye, projecting an image of perfection. Every relationship, every decision, every perceived misstep became fodder for gossip columns. In an era when an actress's personal life could overshadow her professional achievements, Susan's determination to guard her privacy only fueled speculation. By this point, Susan had also begun to feel the weight of an unspoken rule in Hollywood. Actresses had an expiration date. While male actors could continue to thrive well into middle age, women were often discarded once their youth faded. Susan was in her early 30s, but she could sense the whispers growing louder. The roles were becoming scarcer, and the industry seemed eager to move on to the next young starlet. Her struggle wasn't limited to external forces. Susan's own perfectionism and high standards often set her apart, but also made collaboration difficult. She was known to challenge directors and push back against subpar scripts. While this earned her the respect of some, it alienated others. In Hollywood, where compliance often outweighed creativity, Susan's insistence on quality was a double-edged sword. As the 1960s wore on, the cracks in Susan's career began to show. The offers became fewer and the roles less significant. While she continued to appear in high-profile television shows, her film ambitions remained unfulfilled. Hollywood, once captivated by her talent and beauty, was beginning to see her as a liability. Too independent, too demanding, too unwilling to play the game. For Susan, this wasn't just a career impasse. It was a personal crisis. She had given everything to her craft, only to find herself pushed to the margins of an industry she had worked so hard to conquer. But Susan Oliver wasn't one to fade quietly into obscurity. She was about to make a bold move that would redefine her life, even as it took her further away from the bright lights of Hollywood. A sky full of freedom. In 1967, Susan Oliver did something that few Hollywood stars would have even considered. She enrolled in flight school. For Susan, aviation wasn't a mere hobby. It was a passion that bordered on obsession. The allure of flying offered a freedom and control that the film industry, with its rigid structures and gatekeepers, could never provide. Her journey as a pilot was more than symbolic. It was historic. In 1968, Susan competed in the Powder Puff Derby, an all-female transcontinental air race. She didn't just participate, she finished in 4th place, a remarkable achievement for someone relatively new to the field. But she wasn't content with just racing. Susan set her sights on breaking records. Her most daring feat came in 1969 when she embarked on a solo transatlantic flight in a single-engine Piper Comanche. This was no glamorous stunt. It was a grueling, perilous journey requiring immense skill and fortitude. She became one of the few women of her time to complete such a flight, earning her recognition in aviation circles. Flying wasn't just a challenge for Susan, it was an escape. Hollywood had become a source of constant frustration, with its endless rejections and compromises. In the skies, there were no casting directors, no scripts to follow, no roles to fit into. It was just her, the plane, and the horizon. But her boldness came at a cost. Susan's dedication to flying often conflicted with her acting career. Producers saw her aviation pursuits as a distraction, a sign that she wasn't fully committed to Hollywood. Opportunities began to dry up, and some in the industry quietly wrote her off as unpredictable and difficult to manage. For Susan, though, flying was never a choice between two worlds. It was an extension of her identity. She once described being in the cockpit as a form of therapy, a way to push back against the constraints she faced on the ground. Aviation gave her what Hollywood never could, the power to navigate her own path. By the time Susan returned to acting in the early 1970s, she was no longer the rising star Hollywood remembered. But she didn't seem to care. Her heart belonged to the skies, and for Susan Oliver, that was worth more than any role. Behind closed doors, a life of quiet turmoil. While Susan Oliver's love for aviation brought her moments of liberation, her personal life told a more complex story. Beneath her confident, adventurous exterior was a woman grappling with isolation and health struggles that cast long shadows over her achievements. Susan never married, a rarity for women of her era, especially in Hollywood. She once candidly remarked that she had no time for men who couldn't handle her independence. While her choice to remain single reflected her fiercely individualistic nature, it also underscored the challenges she faced in finding a partner who understood her unconventional pursuits. Friends described her as both deeply private and deeply lonely, a paradox that seemed to define much of her life. Her career frustrations compounded her personal struggles. By the late 1960s, the roles she once commanded had dwindled to sporadic guest appearances on television shows. The industry that had once celebrated her versatility now seemed indifferent to her presence. Hollywood's focus had shifted, and Susan, unwilling to play by its rules, was left behind. Then came her battle with health issues. In the early 1970s, Susan was diagnosed with breast cancer, a devastating blow that she kept private for years. Despite undergoing a mastectomy, she rarely spoke publicly about her condition, choosing instead to focus on her work and her love of flying. The resilience she displayed was remarkable, but the toll was undeniable. Friends noted that Susan's retreat from the spotlight wasn't just about her health or her frustrations with Hollywood. It was a response to the relentless pressure of being perfect. The industry's expectations for actresses to maintain their beauty, charm, and youth often left little room for vulnerability or imperfection. For someone as fiercely independent as Susan, that pressure became suffocating. Yet even in her struggles, Susan remained active. She made occasional television appearances, directed a short film, and continued to fly whenever she could. Aviation remained her refuge, a way to reclaim the control she often felt she lacked in her personal and professional life. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Susan Oliver was no longer a name that lit up marquees, but behind closed doors, she was still fighting against illness, against loneliness, and against a world that had too often underestimated her. The silent descent. As the 1980s progressed, Susan Oliver's presence in Hollywood became increasingly rare. While she occasionally appeared in guest roles on TV series like Murder, She Wrote, and Simon & Simon, the days of regular work were long behind her. The industry had largely moved on, favoring younger, fresher faces. For Susan, who had never conformed to Hollywood's rigid expectations, the shift was less a defeat and more a natural progression in a life that had always resisted the status quo, but her ambitions hadn't faded. In 1982, she made a bold attempt to transition behind the camera, directing an episode of MASH. It was a significant achievement. Female directors were exceedingly rare at the time. Susan's episode, Hey, Look Me Over, received praise, and she expressed a desire to do more directing. Yet, opportunities remained scarce, and the barriers for women in the director's chair proved as formidable as those she'd faced as an actress. Susan's health struggles, which had begun quietly years earlier, now loomed larger. Her battle with cancer was ongoing, and while she kept much of it private, the effects were evident. She withdrew further from the public eye, choosing to focus on what mattered most to her, flying. She remained a fixture in the aviation community, often seen at air shows and speaking passionately about the importance of women in flight. Her final years were marked by a quiet determination to live life on her own terms. Friends recall that even as her health declined, she retained her sharp wit and independent spirit. She was no longer the face that had captivated television audiences or the daring pilot who had raced across continents, but she was still Susan, unyielding, unapologetic, and uniquely herself. Final years in the shadows. As Susan Oliver approached the end of her life, the spark of her early career and aviation feats remained undimmed in the hearts of those who knew her best. Yet for the public, her star had faded. This wasn't unusual in Hollywood, a place where fame burns brightly and vanishes just as quickly, but for Susan, her retreat wasn't a failure, it was a choice. In the 1980s, Susan continued to pursue her passions quietly. Aviation was her sanctuary, a space where she could escape the confines of her Hollywood identity. She often spoke at events celebrating women pilots, sharing her experiences and encouraging younger generations to take to the skies. She became an advocate for female empowerment in aviation, stressing that the cockpit was no place for gender barriers. At the same time, her focus shifted inward. She sought creative outlets that didn't rely on the approval of an industry that had long since turned its back. She explored writing, contributing ideas for television projects, and working on personal reflections. Despite her health challenges, Susan remained intellectually active, driven by the same determination that had carried her through countless battles in her life. Her private life during these years remained just that, private. Susan was never one to court publicity, and she avoided the kind of tell-all interviews that many of her contemporaries used to reignite their fame. Instead, she surrounded herself with close friends and colleagues who admired her unyielding spirit and respected her need for solitude. When Susan's health took a turn for the worse, she faced it with the same quiet resilience that had defined her life. By this point, she had come to terms with her place in the world, far removed from the glamour of Hollywood, yet filled with the satisfaction of having lived authentically. On May 10, 1990, Susan Oliver passed away at the age of 58 from complications related to cancer. Her death went largely unnoticed by the Hollywood machine that had once celebrated her. There were no grand tributes or retrospectives, only the quiet mourning of those who had known her brilliance and resilience. Her death in 1990 was met with little fanfare, but those who remembered her spoke of a woman who defied expectations at every turn. From her groundbreaking flight across the Atlantic to her refusal to play Hollywood's game, Susan Oliver left behind a legacy that, though understated, was deeply impactful. She had stepped out of the limelight, not in retreat, but in defiance of a world that demanded she be something she wasn't. In her final years, Susan found a quiet kind of freedom, one that required no audience, no applause, only the satisfaction of living life on her own terms.